The video opens with a shot of a grand mansion draped in snow with flickering holiday lights visible from the outside. Inside, though, it's dark and still, a striking contrast that tells its own story. Narration begins in a somber tone. Behind every grand wall, there's an untold story. Behind these luxurious gates lives a woman who has everything, except the one thing that truly matters. The camera pans across the elegant but cold decor. Crystal chandeliers sparkle in the dim evening light, while the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock echoes in the stillness. We hear faint footsteps as we meet our protagonist, Margarete, dressed in tailored clothes, pearls on her neck, her face stern, her eyes hiding decades of secrets. The narrator's voice shifts slightly, a mix of sarcasm and sadness. Meet Margaret, richer than anyone you'd ever know, but more alone than she'd ever admit. The camera zooms in on Margaret, sitting at a long, lavishly decorated dining table, so long it feels almost endless. Before her lies an untouched meal. There's no warmth, no chatter, no joy, only silence, hollow and deafening. When you've spent a lifetime building your empire, keeping everyone at arm's length, loneliness becomes your only companion. The introduction closes on Margaret's face. Her expression reveals indifference, masking an underlying emptiness. But even the coldest hearts can be warmed, sometimes by something far greater than riches. Margaret lived in a world of opulence, where comfort was abundant, but warmth was nowhere to be found. Her mansion stood colossal, a labyrinth of immaculate rooms adorned with fine draperies and priceless art. Despite its beauty, it felt hollow, like a museum filled with relics, all perfectly preserved, but with no life to give them meaning. Margaret's life was methodically calculated, stripped of any emotion that she deemed a distraction. Her staff catered to her every whim, yet they were invisible to her, shadows who worked tirelessly, maintaining her illusion of perfection. She had convinced herself long ago that true independence meant isolation, that to allow others in was to invite complications, and complications were bad for business. It was early December, and the world outside had begun to shimmer with holiday cheer. Street corners were bright with twinkling lights. Carolers filled the air with song, and the city bustled with festive excitement. But Margaret's mansion remained silent. No tree, no wreath, no lights. Christmas to her was a frivolity, a season when people allowed their emotions to blind them to what really mattered, self-reliance. One evening, Margaret sat in her study, a grand room with rows of books she never touched and a fireplace that hadn't held a flame in years. Silence weighed heavily in the room, broken only by the shuffle of papers as she reviewed her financial records. The numbers offered her comfort. They were consistent, logical, unlike people who were messy and unpredictable. Suddenly, a soft knock broke the stillness. Margaret frowned, visibly annoyed. "Enter," she called, her voice cold. The door creaked open, and a young maid appeared in the doorway. "Ma'am, would you like us to set up any holiday decorations this year?" The staff thought it might bring some warmth to the— "No," Margaret interrupted, her tone sharp. "There will be no decorations. Focus on your duties, not on pointless activities." The maid nodded quickly, retreating as though she had committed a crime. Margaret sighed, shaking her head as she returned her gaze to the numbers. Yet her focus had slipped. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the window. Snowflakes were beginning to fall, painting the grounds in a pure, untouched white. For a fleeting moment, she felt something she couldn't quite name, a pull toward the warmth she had denied herself for so long. But she dismissed it. Emotions were a weakness, she thought. That night, Margaret struggled to sleep. She tossed and turned, her thoughts drifting back to moments she had buried under layers of wealth and distance. Memories of her late husband's laughter, the warmth of past gatherings, echoes of a time when her life had been more than just numbers and solitude. These memories haunted her in the cold, dark silence of her mansion. The next morning, her routine resumed. Breakfast served on a silver platter, newspapers neatly folded beside her cup of tea. She flipped through the headlines, detached, until one article caught her eye, an appeal for charity donations to provide Christmas dinners for families in need. Margarete scoffed, muttering to herself, people always wanting handouts. They should work harder instead of waiting for someone to save them. Despite her dismissive words, she found herself rereading the article. She shook her head, trying to redirect her focus, but the image of children in need lingered in her mind like a shadow. Later that day, Margarete decided to get out of the house. She summoned her driver, instructing him to take her to the city. She needed a reminder of why her wealth made her superior, why her choices had been justified. The car moved silently through the streets, past cheerful homes adorned with decorations. Children played in the snow, their laughter a sharp contrast to the cold emptiness Margarete carried within. As they turned onto a quieter street, a shortcut to her destination, Margarete saw something that made her chest tighten. A little girl, no older than 8, stood at the corner with a small basket of flowers. Her coat was too thin for the winter chill, her small hands trembling as she held out the flowers to passing strangers. Her voice was almost lost in the bustling noise of the city. Flowers for sale. Please, flowers for sale. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, and in that instant, Margarete felt something shift within her, a pang of regret, a flicker of something long forgotten. The girl's eyes were wide and hopeful, her determination clear even in the cold. It pierced through Margarete's armor of indifference, touching something she thought she had buried forever. "Drive on," she said abruptly. Turning away, the car moved on, but the image of the girl lingered. Her thin coat, her trembling hands, her eyes, full of hope, remained with Margarete, awakening an unfamiliar unease. When she returned to her mansion, the emptiness of the grand hall seemed more pronounced. She wandered aimlessly, her footsteps echoing against the marble floors. For the first time in a long time, she found herself drawn to a portrait of her late husband. His face, warm and kind, seemed to silently question her. "What have you become?" Margarete reached out, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the frame. "Would you be proud of me now?" she whispered, her voice cracking. She had built walls so high that no one could scale them, and now those very walls had become her prison. That night, sleep eluded her. Her mind kept drifting back to the little girl, her eyes full of hope, the harsh winter air that made her shiver. Margarete tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept returning, growing louder. It was as if a tiny crack had formed in her icy facade, and the cold was beginning to seep inside. As dawn broke, Margarete sat up, her gaze distant, her thoughts lingering on the little girl. For the first time in years, she felt something stir within her, a flicker of something like regret, perhaps even longing. She stood by the window, watching the snow fall softly on the grounds of her estate. "Is there more to life than this?" she whispered into the empty room, her breath fogging up the glass. The question lingered, suspended in the quiet of the early morning, as the first light of a new day began to fill the sky. The next day, Margarete woke up feeling restless. There was an uneasiness in her chest that she could not shake off. The untouched breakfast in front of her, served with luxurious silverware, suddenly felt meaningless. Something had shifted within her, making it impossible to return to her usual controlled indifference. She decided to go out. It was unusual for her to leave her mansion without a purpose, but she needed a distraction, anything to reassure herself that the life she built was indeed the right one. She called her driver, James. As the car moved through the gates, the world outside came alive. Bustling streets, families shopping, couples laughing, children pointing excitedly at the holiday decorations. Normally, these things seemed irrelevant to her. Today, they held her attention. James noticed her unusual silence. Usually, she would be busy with her phone, going over business matters, but today her gaze was lost in the scenes outside. They slowed to a stop for a group of children crossing the street, their laughter echoing like bells. Margaret found herself leaning forward, her eyes following them until they joined their parents at a small flower stand. The sight brought back the image of the little girl she had seen the day before, standing alone in the cold. Her gaze then shifted to the woman behind the flower stand, her hands wrapped in worn gloves, her face flushed from the cold. Despite her obvious exhaustion, the woman kept smiling, passing flowers to customers with care. Margarete felt an unexpected heaviness. She looked away quickly, as if the moment had become too intimate. "Ma'am, shall we continue?" James's voice brought her back to reality. She straightened up. "Yes, James, go on," she replied, her voice steady, though her thoughts were anything but. As they moved on, Margarete found herself unable to shake the image of the woman at the flower stand. Why did it bother her so much? She had chosen wealth and security, and it had always seemed like enough. Yet, the woman's tired smile lingered in her mind, a reminder of something she couldn't define. They passed by a neighborhood she hadn't visited in years, a place she and her late husband had lived when they had nothing but hope. She remembered decorating a tiny tree by the window of their modest apartment, believing that one day they would have more. And indeed, she had more now, but the cost seemed heavier than she had imagined. The warmth of those humble years was now gone, replaced by silence and grandeur. James turned towards a local park. Bustling with people enjoying the winter day, she watched a group of children building a snowman, their laughter filling the air. A couple strolled arm in arm, smiling despite the cold. Such warmth was foreign to her now, something she had closed herself off from long ago. "James," she said suddenly. He looked at her, waiting. "Pull over." He did as instructed, and Margaret stepped out into the biting cold. She hadn't dressed for a walk, but something compelled her to leave the confines of the car. She walked slowly, observing the people passing by, each absorbed in their lives, some offering her polite smiles. She found a bench, brushed off the snow, and sat down. From there, she watched the children, the couples, the families gathering around. The cold wind nipped at her face, but she barely felt it. A group of children ran by, their laughter ringing out, and she found herself smiling faintly. She watched for a while, feeling something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of longing for something she could not quite name. After some time, she returned to the car. James looked at her, concern in his eyes. "Everything all right, ma'am?" he asked. Margaret nodded, though her voice lacked certainty. "Yes, James. Everything is fine." She turned to look out the window as they drove away, her reflection showing a face that looked the same, but with eyes that seemed different, less guarded, more questioning. Upon returning to her mansion, she walked through the front door, the silence enveloping her like a heavy blanket. She stood in the foyer, looking at the grand staircase and the stillness of the house. Everything was as it always had been, perfect, orderly, and lifeless. But now the silence seemed unbearable, the emptiness undeniable. She took a deep breath and walked toward her study, not entirely sure what she was looking for. But knowing she couldn't ignore the change she felt inside, it was unsettling, unfamiliar. But perhaps it was the beginning of something she needed to understand. Margaret had always prided herself on her strength, her ability to stay unmoved by emotions. But as the days passed, the feeling of unease refused to leave her. There was an emptiness she could no longer ignore, and it lingered like a shadow over everything she did. She tried to bury herself in her usual activities, reading reports, managing her finances, but none of it brought her any comfort anymore. One particularly cold evening, Margaret found herself standing in her study, staring at the framed photograph of her late husband. It was a picture taken years ago, back when their dreams were simpler, back when they still believed that love and hope were enough to carry them through life's trials. His face, frozen in time, looked so different from her own. There was a warmth in his smile, something that had long since faded from her world. She sank into the armchair beside the fireplace, her gaze still fixed on the photograph. A sense of longing stirred in her, a feeling that had become more frequent recently. She tried to shake it off, but it clung to her, refusing to let go. That night, her sleep was restless. Her dreams were filled with scenes from her past, memories she had locked away long ago. She saw herself as a young woman, laughing alongside her husband, dancing in their small apartment on a winter's night, the two of them twirling beneath the soft glow of holiday lights. She could feel his arms around her, his laughter in her ear, the warmth of his presence. It was all so vivid, so real, that for a fleeting moment, it felt as if she had stepped back in time. But then, as dreams often do, the scene shifted. The laughter faded, the lights dimmed, and suddenly she was alone. The apartment was empty, cold. She stood in the dark, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. She reached out, but there was nothing there, just emptiness. Margaret woke up with a start, her heart pounding, her room cast in shadows. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The dream had left her feeling raw, vulnerable in a way she hadn't felt in years. She wrapped her arms around herself as if to ward off the chill that had settled deep inside her. The next morning, she avoided her usual routines. The numbers, the reports, the meetings, all of it seemed trivial now. She found herself wandering the halls of her mansion, her footsteps echoing against the marble floors. It was so quiet, so empty, that it almost felt oppressive. She paused at the window, looking out at the vast expanse of snow-covered grounds. It was beautiful, but there was no warmth in it, no life. Margaret decided she needed to get out. The walls of the mansion were closing in on her. And she needed air, needed to feel something real. She called James again, instructing him to take her to the part of town she had seen a few days earlier, the neighborhood where she had once lived, back when life had been simpler. James drove in silence, understanding that this wasn't the time for questions. Margarete watched as familiar streets came into view. They looked different now, more worn, more aged, but there was still a sense of life here, a sense of community that had been missing from her own existence for so long. She asked James to stop near a small square, one that she remembered from her past. It was where she and her husband used to come on weekends, buying pastries from the bakery on the corner and eating them on a bench beneath the old oak tree. The bakery was still there, though it looked a little older, a little faded. She could see families inside, children pointing at the treats behind the glass, their faces full of joy and excitement. Margaret got out of the car, her feet crunching against the snow as she walked towards the bakery. She paused at the window, watching the scene unfold inside. There was a young couple, their heads bent close together, laughing at something the other had said. There was an elderly man with his granddaughter, her eyes wide with wonder as she chose a colorful cookie. It was all so ordinary, yet it felt extraordinary to her. This simple connection between people, this warmth that she had long denied herself. She entered the bakery, the bell above the door chiming softly. The warmth of the place enveloped her, the scent of freshly baked bread and sugar filling the air. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The girl behind the counter smiled at her, her expression open and welcoming. "Can I help you?" she asked. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "A loaf of bread." "Please, and..." She paused, glancing at the display of cookies. "One of those as well." She pointed at the colorful cookie the little girl had chosen. The girl behind the counter nodded, quickly wrapping up Margaret's order. As she handed it over, Margaret reached into her purse, her fingers brushing against the neatly arranged bills. She pulled out a note, handing it to the girl, who smiled and gave her change. Margaret left the bakery, the warmth of the small bag in her hands. She stood there for a moment, looking around at the square. It was quieter now, the crowd having thinned out. She walked over to the old oak tree. Sitting down on the bench beneath it, she opened the bag, taking out the bread and breaking off a piece. The steam rose into the cold air, and she took a bite, the warmth spreading through her. It was just bread. Simple, ordinary bread. But there, sitting beneath the tree with the snow falling softly around her, it felt like more. It felt like a memory, a piece of something she had lost. Margaret looked around the square, watching as people went about their day. She felt a sense of longing, but also a sense of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for her. She had spent so many years closing herself off, shutting out the world in favor of her wealth and her comfort. But now, for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine something different, something warmer, something more connected. She finished the bread, the cold biting at her cheeks. But she didn't mind. There, in that small square, she felt more alive than she had in years. She stood up, brushing the crumbs from her lap, and walked back to the car. James opened the door for her, and she settled into the seat. "Home, Mum?" James asked. Margaret paused, looking out at the square one last time. She nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "Yes, James. Let's go home." As they drove away, Margaret felt something shift within her. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough. Enough to know that the walls she had built around herself were starting to crack, that maybe there was still time for something more. The mansion was still as silent and grand as always when they returned. But this time, Margaret felt a little less alone. She looked at the grand staircase, the polished floors, and the vast rooms. They were still empty, but perhaps they didn't have to stay that way forever. She took a deep breath, setting the small bag from the bakery on the counter. The colorful cookie peeked out, a reminder of a simple joy she had almost forgotten. Margaret smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her. She didn't know what was next, but for the first time in a long time, she was willing to find out. The next morning, Margaret woke with a feeling she couldn't quite define. It was no longer just the restlessness that had plagued her for weeks. It felt like something else, something that pulled her to leave behind her usual routine. Instead of heading directly to her study to review financials, she lingered over her morning tea, her eyes wandering to the frost-covered window. She watched the snow fall, each flake joining the others in silence, and it felt peaceful. The world outside looked softer, calmer. Margaret found herself drawn to that calmness. Maybe, she thought, it was time to do something different. She stood up from the table, her mind made up. There was a sense of urgency mixed with excitement, a quiet realization that maybe she had been looking at her life the wrong way. She needed to explore these feelings further. Instead of calling James, She decided to walk. Wrapping herself in her warmest coat and gloves, Margaret stepped outside. The cold air stung her face, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in front of her. She walked past her meticulously maintained garden, now blanketed in snow, her footsteps leaving tracks along the stone path. Margaret took a direction she hadn't walked in years, leading her away from the sprawling estates of her neighborhood and towards the simpler part of town. She passed by small stores, with their windows covered in Christmas decorations, and watched as people hurried by with bags of gifts, smiles on their faces. There was something genuine and spontaneous about the scene, something that had been missing from her life for a long time. After walking for a while, Margaret found herself in front of a modest community center. She had driven past it many times, but had never once given it much thought. Today, however, something made her stop. She watched as people, young and old, went in and out carrying boxes and bags. The sign on the door read, "Holiday Donations for Families in Need." Margaret hesitated for a moment before deciding to step inside. The door swung open, revealing a room bustling with activity. Tables were set up covered in food donations, clothes and wrapped gifts. Volunteers were sorting the items, their faces filled with concentration but also warmth. There was laughter, light-hearted chatter, and the sound of children's voices. She stood there for a moment, unsure of her place, until a young woman approached her. She had an open face, her hair tied back loosely, and she wore a sweater that had clearly seen better days. "Hello, are you here to help out?" the young woman asked, her smile warm and inviting. Margaret blinked, momentarily taken aback. She hadn't thought that far ahead. She had simply followed an impulse. But as she looked around the room, at the people giving their time to make someone else's holiday a little better, she found herself nodding. "Yes," she said, her voice almost surprising her. I'd like to help." The woman's smile widened. "Great. We could always use an extra pair of hands. I'm Anna." "By the way, Margaret," she replied, her voice softening. There was something about Anna's kindness, something so genuine that made her feel at ease. Anna led her over to one of the tables where they were sorting boxes of winter clothes. Margaret took off her gloves, set them aside, and began to help. At first, her movements were hesitant, awkward, but soon she found herself falling into a rhythm. There was something almost meditative about the work. Taking a box, sorting the clothes, folding them neatly, and placing them in a pile. As the morning turned into afternoon, Margaret found herself talking to Anna. It was strange, and yet it felt natural. Anna talked about her work, how she had been organizing the donation drive for years. She spoke of the families who would receive the items, how even the smallest contributions made such a difference in their lives. Margaret listened, genuinely interested. It had been a long time since she had felt truly engaged in a conversation, one that wasn't about business, investments, or plans. She listened to Anna talk about the people who came through the community center, the challenges they faced, and the resilience they showed in spite of it all. At some point, Anna looked at her, curiosity in her eyes. "You're not from around here, are you?" Margaret shook her head. "No, I live nearby, but I haven't been here before. I suppose I've kept to myself for too long." Anna nodded, smiling gently. "Well, we're happy to have you today, and for what it's worth, I think it's never too late to start something new." Margaret looked down at the sweater she was folding, her heart feeling lighter. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly, and for the first time in a long while, she believed it. By the end of the afternoon, Margaret had helped sort dozens of boxes. Her hands ached slightly, but it was a satisfying kind of tiredness, something real and honest. As she left the community center, Anna waved her goodbye, thanking her for her help and inviting her to come back any time. Margaret walked back to her mansion, her footsteps slow and measured. The world seemed different somehow. It was still cold, still covered in snow, but there was something warmer now, an openness in her heart that hadn't been there before. When she arrived home, the mansion was as quiet as ever, but the silence didn't feel as heavy. She hung her coat by the door and walked into the kitchen. The cookie she had bought the day before was still there, wrapped neatly in its paper. Margaret unwrapped it, took a bite and smiled. It was sweet and simple, and it tasted like something she had forgotten, a reminder of what it felt like to be part of something beyond herself. She took a deep breath, feeling the warmth spread through her. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Margaret spent the next few days with a feeling she could only describe as lightness. It was subtle but noticeable, like a burden that had been slowly lifted off her shoulders. She found herself thinking about Anna, about the people at the community center, and about the simple warmth she had felt there. She even thought about going back, though part of her still hesitated, but it was undeniable. Something inside her was changing, shifting. One evening, as she was preparing for a quiet dinner alone, her phone rang. Margarete picked it up, surprised to see her granddaughter's name flashing on the screen. It had been a while since they last spoke, and Margaret couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. She had been so focused on herself and her world of material comfort that she had let relationships fade into the background. "Grandma," came the voice on the other end, soft but filled with warmth. "It's Claire. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Margaret's heart softened at the sound of her granddaughter's voice. "Not at all, Claire," she said, settling down at the kitchen table. "It's wonderful to hear from you. How are you?" "I'm good, Grandma. I've been thinking about you lately," Claire said, her tone gentle. "Actually, I was wondering if you might want to come to our Christmas dinner this year. I know you've always preferred to keep to yourself, but it would mean a lot to me if you could come. I've missed you." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She hadn't attended a family gathering in years. There was always an excuse: work, meetings, the effort of leaving her comfortable bubble. But now, after everything she had felt and experienced recently, Claire's invitation touched her deeply. The simple words, "I've missed you," echoed in her mind, a reminder of all that she had distanced herself from. "Claire, Margaret began, her voice catching slightly. She took a deep breath. "I'd love to come." There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a joyful exclamation. "Really, Grandma? That's wonderful. Mom and Dad will be so happy to see you." Margaret smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you for inviting me, Claire. I think it's time for a change." They spoke for a while longer, talking about the upcoming holiday plans, about Claire's college classes, and even about some of Claire's friends. It was the longest conversation Margaret had had with her granddaughter in years. And when they finally said goodbye, she felt a sense of contentment she hadn't realized she needed. The days leading up to Christmas seemed to fly by. Margaret found herself looking forward to the dinner, though she was also nervous. She had been away for so long. What if she didn't know what to say or how to fit in? But as she thought about it more, she realized that this was what change was about. Stepping out of her comfort zone, letting go of the control she had held onto for so long. On Christmas Eve, Margaret decided to visit the community center again. This time she was prepared. She'd gone shopping the day before and bought toys and warm clothes for the donation drive. She wanted to give back, even if it was just a small gesture. She wanted to be part of something beyond herself. When she arrived at the community center, it was bustling with activity, just like before. Anna spotted her almost immediately, her face lighting up with a big smile. "Margaret, "You came back," she exclaimed. Walking over to greet her, Margaret smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her. "I did. I brought some donations," she said, lifting the bags she had brought. "I thought they might be useful." Anna's eyes widened in appreciation. "Oh, Margaret, that's so kind of you. Thank you. Come, let me help you with those." Together, they brought the bags over to the donation table. Margaret watched as Anna unpacked them, the toys and clothes quickly being sorted and prepared for distribution. There was something about watching her contributions being used to help others that filled Margaret with a deep sense of purpose, a sense that perhaps she was finally doing something that truly mattered. Anna looked over at her, her expression thoughtful. "You know, we're going to be handing out these donations tomorrow morning, right before Christmas Day. It's always a wonderful event, seeing the families come by. You should come, if you're free. I think you'd really enjoy it." Margaret hesitated. Tomorrow was the day she was supposed to go to Claire's for dinner, but the event was in the morning. She could do both. And the thought of seeing the families receiving the donations, of seeing the difference that even a small gesture could make, made her heart swell. "I'd like that, Anna," Margaret said. Her voice filled with sincerity. "I'll be here." Anna's smile widened. "Wonderful. I know the families will appreciate it, and so will we." Margaret left the community center that day feeling lighter than she had in years. She was no longer just an observer of life. She was participating, she was giving, and she was connecting. The walls she had built around herself were slowly coming down, replaced by bridges that reached out to others. On Christmas morning, Margaret woke up early, feeling an excitement she hadn't felt since she was a child. She dressed warmly and made her way to the community center. The room was already bustling with people, volunteers setting up tables, families beginning to arrive. There was a hum of activity, of laughter, of gratitude that filled the space. Margaret spent the morning helping to distribute the donations. She handed out toys to children, their eyes lighting up with joy, and gave warm clothes to parents who thanked her with tears in their eyes. It was overwhelming, but in the best way possible. She felt connected to each person she met, even if it was just for a moment. She was part of something larger than herself, and it filled her with a sense of belonging that she hadn't realized she was missing. When the event ended, Anna came over to her, giving her a tight hug. "Thank you so much for coming, Margaret. You've made a real difference today." Margaret smiled, her eyes misty. "No, Anna. You all have made a difference for me. Thank you for letting me be a part of this." As she left the community center, Margaret felt a sense of fulfillment that was new to her, an understanding that true wealth wasn't in what you owned, but in what you gave. She made her way to Claire's house for the Christmas dinner, her heart light and open. This year, for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt that she was truly celebrating Christmas, not with grand gifts or opulence, but with love, connection, and a renewed spirit. Margaret arrived at Claire's home in the early evening, her heart pounding slightly as she approached the front door. She could hear laughter and chatter coming from inside, the sounds of her family enjoying one another's company. For a moment she hesitated, wondering if she would feel out of place. But she quickly shook off the thought. She had made a promise to Claire, and more importantly, she had made a promise to herself. Taking a deep breath, she rang the doorbell. Within seconds, the door swung open, and Claire stood there, her eyes lighting up at the sight of her grandmother. "Grandma!" she exclaimed, her smile wide as she quickly pulled Margaret into a hug. Margaret felt her heart swell, warmth spreading through her chest. She hugged her granddaughter back, feeling a tenderness she hadn't realized how much she missed. "It's so good to see you, Claire," Margaret said, her voice soft. It's so good to see you too. Come in, everyone's been waiting. Claire led her inside, taking her coat and gloves and hanging them by the door. Margaret looked around as they entered the living room, taking in the festive decorations, the twinkling lights, the garland wrapped around the banister, the smell of freshly baked cookies wafting through the house. It felt like the holidays in a way that her mansion never had, warm, inviting, filled with love. Claire's parents, Margaret's son and daughter-in-law, came forward to greet her, their expressions a mix of surprise and genuine joy. "Mom, we're so happy you came," her son David said, his voice touched with emotion as he leaned in to hug her. Margaret smiled, a little hesitant, but the warmth in her son's voice eased her nerves. "I'm happy to be here," she replied. She had distanced herself from these moments for so long, and now, standing in the warmth of her family, she realized how much she had missed out on. The disconnect had been her choice. But being here, she knew that it didn't have to continue. The evening was full of small, simple joys. They sat down for dinner at a large table, Claire on one side of Margaret and David on the other. The table was covered with dishes of food, roasted vegetables, a golden brown turkey, mashed potatoes, and warm rolls. It was nothing extravagant, but it was made with care, and that made all the difference. They began to eat, and the conversation flowed easily. Claire spoke animatedly about her classes, her eyes lighting up as she shared stories about her friends and the projects she was working on. David and his wife, Laura, spoke of their plans for the new year, the goals they had as a family. They included Margaret in every part of the conversation, never making her feel like she was an outsider, despite the years she had kept her distance. As she listened, Margaret felt a warmth growing within her. She found herself laughing at Claire's stories, nodding as David spoke about his work, and even sharing some of her own memories of holidays when David was young, of the simpler times when their family had just started out. It was like a bridge was being built, one moment at a time, reconnecting her to the people she had drifted away from. There was a moment during the dinner when Claire looked at her grandmother, her eyes filled with something Margaret recognized: love, mixed with hope. "Grandma, I'm so happy you're here," Claire said, her voice quiet but sincere. "I've missed having you with us." Margaret felt her eyes mist over his, her throat tightening with emotion. She reached out, taking Claire's hand and giving it a gentle squeeze. "I've missed this too, Claire. More than I realized." Her voice wavered, but she didn't mind. It felt good to let those words out, to let herself feel everything she had kept bottled up for so long. As the dinner came to a close, they moved to the living room for dessert. Claire brought out a tray of cookies and cups of hot cocoa, setting them on the coffee table. They sat together, the twinkling lights from the Christmas tree casting a soft glow over the room. David played some soft music in the background. And the atmosphere was perfect, comfortable, and filled with warmth. Margaret sipped her cocoa, her gaze drifting to the fireplace, where a small fire crackled, giving off a gentle heat. For so long, her world had been devoid of this simple closeness, this feeling of being surrounded by people who cared. And it wasn't about the decorations or the food. It was about being present, about allowing herself to be vulnerable and open to the love that was there, waiting for her. She looked at her family, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had been so afraid of losing herself in the messiness of human connection, so focused on maintaining her control and independence. But now she saw that in trying to protect herself, she had only ended up alone. And while she could never get back the years she had lost, she could start now. She could make different choices, take different steps. That night, as they laughed over dessert and shared stories from years past, Margarete felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, a sense of belonging, It wasn't something that could be bought or planned for. It was something that had to be nurtured, given freely and openly. She realized that this was what she had been missing all these years. Not wealth, not status, but connection. Real, meaningful connection. Later, when it was time for her to leave, Claire hugged her tightly at the door. "You'll come again soon, right, Grandma?" she asked, her voice hopeful. Margaret smiled, her eyes meeting Claire's. "Yes, my dear, I will, I promise." As she walked back to her car, James waiting patiently for her, Margarete felt a deep sense of peace. She looked back at the house, the warm glow from the windows spilling out into the cold night, and she smiled to herself. She knew that this was just the beginning. There were still changes to be made, bridges to rebuild, and time to catch up on. But for the first time in a long time, Margaret was not afraid of what lay ahead. She was ready to face it, one step at a time, surrounded by the people she loved. The days after Christmas were unlike anything Margaret had experienced in years. She felt a lightness, a sense of purpose that hadn't been present in her life for a long time. She was no longer content to let the world pass her by while she watched from her opulent but empty mansion. Instead, she felt the urge to reconnect with the people she had distanced herself from, her friends, her family, her community. One particularly frosty morning, Margaret found herself dialing a number she hadn't called in years. It was her old friend Eleanor, someone she had once been very close to before their paths diverged. Eleanor had been a spirited woman, full of laughter and light. They had shared countless afternoons over tea, speaking of their dreams and fears. But as Margaret became increasingly focused on her business and her wealth, she had let those afternoons become rare and eventually non-existent. The phone rang, and with each passing second, Margaret considered hanging up. But before she could make a decision, the ringing stopped. "Hello?" Eleanor's voice came through, familiar, though slightly more aged. Margaret took a breath, her nerves getting the best of her for a moment. "Eleanor? It's Margaret. I hope I'm not disturbing you." There was a brief silence on the line, and then a surprised but warm chuckle. "Margaret! Oh my goodness, I never expected this. How have you been?" Margaret smiled, her chest tightening with both relief and regret. "I've been okay, but I've been thinking about you. I realized how long it's been since we last spoke, and I wanted to reach out." "Well, it certainly has been a while," Eleanor said, her voice softening. "But I'm glad you called. I've missed you, my dear friend." The warmth in Eleanor's words wrapped around Margaret like a blanket. They spoke for a while, exchanging news of their lives, and before she knew it, Margaret found herself laughing at Eleanor's stories, just as she used to years ago. Eleanor hadn't changed. She still had that bright spirit that Margaret remembered, and hearing it again made her feel connected to a part of herself she had almost forgotten. By the end of the conversation, Eleanor suggested they meet for tea, just like old times. Margaret agreed, a genuine smile on her face. She hung up the phone feeling lighter, as if she had just taken another step out of the shadows of her past. There were still bridges to be rebuilt, but this was a start. 2 days later, Margaret found herself standing in front of a small cafe, one that she and Eleanor used to frequent years ago. It had been a quaint spot then, and it remained much the same now. Warm light spilling out from the windows, the smell of freshly brewed tea drifting into the crisp winter air. She pushed the door open, and the small bell above the door chimed, announcing her arrival. Eleanor was already there, sitting at a corner table, her face lighting up as soon as she saw Margaret. She stood up, her arms outstretched. "Margaret, you made it," she said warmly, pulling her into a hug. Margaret embraced her friend, a smile spreading across her face. "Of course, Eleanor. I wouldn't miss this for anything." They settled into their seats, ordering tea, and soon they were deep in conversation. It was as if no time had passed. Margaret felt the years melt away as they spoke, and the familiar comfort of their friendship returned. Eleanor spoke of her children, of her grandchildren, of the ups and downs that life had brought her, and Margaret listened, truly listened, absorbing each story as if she was making up for the years they had lost. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she found herself opening up in a way she hadn't done in a long time. She spoke of her regrets, of the loneliness that had come from chasing only material success, and of her recent experiences working at the community center, reconnecting with her family. Eleanor listened patiently, her eyes kind and understanding. "You know, Margaret," Eleanor said after a while, her voice gentle, "it's never too late to change. And from what you're telling me, it sounds like you're already doing just that. I'm proud of you, truly." Margaret's throat tightened with emotion, and she reached across the table to take Eleanor's hand. "Thank you, Eleanor. I've realized that I've let so much slip away. But I want to change that now. I want to be part of people's lives again, not just watch from a distance." Eleanor squeezed her hand, her eyes shining. "Then you're on the right path, my dear. Just take it one day at a time." They stayed at the cafe for hours, the conversation flowing easily, the laughter coming naturally. For the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself to relax completely, to feel the simple joy of spending time with someone she cared about. It wasn't grand or extravagant, but it was real, and that was enough. When they finally parted ways, Eleanor hugged her tightly. "Promise me we won't let this much time pass before we see each other again," she said. Her smile both teasing and sincere. Margaret laughed softly, nodding. "I promise, Eleanor. I won't let that happen again." As she walked home, the sun beginning to set on the horizon, Margaret felt at peace. She had spent so long building walls, separating herself from everyone, believing it was what she needed to be strong. But now she was beginning to understand that true strength came from connection, from allowing herself to be open and vulnerable. That night, back in her mansion, Margaret sat in front of the fireplace, a cup of tea warming her hands. The house was still, but it no longer felt as cold or as empty as it once had. She thought of Claire, of David, of Eleanor, of Anna at the community center. She thought of the laughter she had shared, the hands she had held, and the people she had touched, and a smile spread across her face. She knew there was still more to do. There were still people she wanted to reach out to, relationships she needed to mend, and steps she needed to take. But she was no longer afraid of that journey. Instead, she welcomed it with open arms, knowing that each small act of connection, each genuine moment of kindness, was building the life she truly wanted, a life filled with warmth, purpose, and love. The past was what it was, full of mistakes, regrets, and missed opportunities. But the future was hers to shape, and Margaret was finally ready to embrace it. The week after reconnecting with Eleanor was filled with a new kind of energy for Margaret. She spent her days with a clear purpose: to reconnect with people, to rebuild bonds she had let fall by the wayside, and to allow herself to be part of others' lives again. But amidst this newfound rhythm, something unexpected happened. It was a cold, foggy morning when Margaret was in the kitchen preparing tea. The sound of the doorbell startled her. She rarely received visitors, especially unannounced. Margaret put the kettle aside and walked to the door, curiosity piqued by who it might be. Opening the door, she was greeted by a woman she didn't immediately recognize. The young woman had a tired but determined expression, her eyes marked with exhaustion, yet holding a glimmer of hope. "Good morning," the woman said timidly. I'm sorry to show up like this, but I'm the mother of the little girl you helped at the community center. I heard from the people there that you had helped with the donations, and I wanted to thank you personally." Margaret stood for a moment in silence. Surprised, she hadn't expected anyone to come to her house to thank her. The generosity she had shown in recent weeks had been part of her effort to reconnect with herself and others, but hearing firsthand about the impact of her actions moved her deeply. "Oh, please, come in," Margaret said, stepping back and opening the door a little wider. "It's much too cold out there." The woman hesitated for a second, but then accepted the invitation. She looked around as she entered, clearly impressed by the size of the house. Margaret led her to the living room, offering her a chair by the fireplace, where a fire crackled gently. "Can I get you some tea?" Margaret asked as she headed to the kitchen. "Yes, thank you," the woman replied, a shy smile appearing on her face. "My name is Rosa." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Rosa. I'm Margaret," she said while preparing the tea. Soon Margaret returned with a tray holding 2 steaming cups. She sat across from Rosa, watching her face as the young woman stared at the fire, seemingly gathering the courage to speak. "I just wanted you to know how much your help meant to us," Rosa said, finally breaking the silence. "The last few months have been tough. I lost my job, and the thought of not having anything to give my daughter for Christmas, it broke my heart. When we came to the community center and saw the toys and clothes, my daughter smiled in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. That meant everything to me." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat, her hands gripping her teacup a bit tighter. She had made those donations thinking she was just helping in a general, impersonal way, but hearing Rosa's story made it all real and tangible. It was a reminder that even the simplest actions had the power to change someone's life. "I'm so happy to hear that, Rosa," Margaret said softly. "Sometimes we forget the impact we can have on others. Seeing you here makes me realize I should have done more. Much sooner." Rosa shook her head, her eyes glistening. "You made a difference in so many families' lives that day. I just wanted you to know that it's more than material things. It's about hope, about showing that someone cares." Margaret felt her eyes sting, but she didn't look away. She was learning that feeling. Being vulnerable was a crucial part of what it meant to truly live. For the first time, the walls of her mansion didn't feel so isolating. Rosa's presence filled the space with genuine warmth, a reminder that the true value of life wasn't in what one owned, but in moments shared. "If there's anything else I can do," Margaret said, placing her cup down, "please don't hesitate to let me know. I'm beginning to understand that we all need each other." Rosa smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face. "Thank you, Margaret. I didn't want to bother you, just thank you." "It's no bother at all," Margarete replied firmly. "Quite the opposite. You've made me see things in a way I needed to see." They continued talking for a while longer, with Margaret listening, as Rosa spoke about the daily struggles of raising her daughter alone, the challenges but also the small victories that brought light into their lives. Rosa wasn't asking for help, she simply wanted to be heard. And Margaret listened with all the attention she could give. When Rosa finally stood up to leave, Margaret accompanied her to the door, feeling a connection with the young mother she never would have expected. "I hope to see you again, Rosa," Margaret said, holding the door open as the cold wind blew in. "You and your daughter are always welcome here." Rosa smiled and nodded. "I'd love that. Thank you again for everything." After Rosa left, Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment, looking out at the snow-covered garden, thinking about all that had changed within her. She had spent so many years focused on her business, on maintaining control, that she had forgotten how powerful kindness could be, not just for those who received it, but for those who gave it. Margaret closed the door, returning to the living room where the fire still crackled. She sat down on the couch, looking into the flames, allowing herself to feel the wave of emotions that washed over her. For the first time, there was no sense of emptiness. There was a feeling of purpose, of connection, that she was finally living in a way that truly mattered. In that moment, Margaret made a decision. She wanted to do more, to help more. Not just with material donations, but with her time, her presence, her willingness to listen. She wanted to be a part of the community she had ignored for so long. She wanted her life to have a real, positive impact. And though there was still much work to be done, she knew she was on the right path. After Rosa's visit, Margaret felt a deep sense of fulfillment and a growing sense of urgency to be more present in the lives of others. She realized that there was still a long way to go, but for once the future didn't seem daunting. Instead, it felt like a blank canvas, a chance to create something meaningful. The next week, she decided to take a bigger step toward engaging with her community. She knew that the community center, which had already sparked such a significant change in her life, was planning to expand their services. Anna had mentioned in passing that they hoped to provide free tutoring for children and job training sessions for adults, but they were struggling to find enough resources to make it happen. Margaret picked up the phone and dialed the number for the community center. Anna answered, her familiar warm voice greeting her. "Margaret, it's wonderful to hear from you," Anna said, a note of surprise mixed with genuine pleasure in her tone. "Hello, Anna," Margaret replied, a smile spreading across her face. "I've been thinking about what you said the last time I visited about the new programs you want to start. I'd like to help in a more significant way this time." There was a brief silence on the line, and Margaret could almost picture Anna's stunned expression. "Really, Margaret, that would be incredible. We could use any help we can get, especially now." Margaret felt warmth blooming in her chest. "I want to fund the expansion," she said, her voice steady. "Whatever resources you need for the tutoring and job training, I'd like to cover it. And I'd also like to volunteer. I think it's time I got more involved personally." There was another pause, and Margaret heard Anna's breath catch. I don't know what to say, Margaret. This is beyond anything we could have hoped for. Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure," Margaret said softly. "I want to do this. I need to do this." Anna's voice, filled with emotion, came back. "Thank you. Margarete, truly this will change so many lives. Why don't we meet tomorrow to discuss everything? I'd love for you to see our plans and be a part of making this happen." Margaret agreed, and they arranged a time for the next day. After she hung up, she felt an energy coursing through her, something she hadn't felt in decades. This was purpose, real and tangible. It wasn't about financial returns or accumulating more. It was about giving, creating opportunities, and becoming part of something greater than herself. The next day, Margaret arrived at the community center with a sense of determination. As she walked through the doors, she could feel the warmth of the place envelop her, the laughter of children playing in one room, the quiet concentration of volunteers working in another. It was a far cry from the stillness of her mansion, but it was exactly what she needed. Anna greeted her with a hug, her eyes filled with gratitude. She led Margaret to a small office where several sketches and plans were spread across a table. Margaret looked at them, her eyes scanning the drawings of new classrooms, the list of resources they would need, and the schedule of activities they hoped to implement. It was ambitious, but it was also beautiful, a vision of what the community could become. "We want to create a space where kids can come after school to learn and be inspired," Anna explained, her voice full of passion. "And for the adults, We want to provide practical skills, job training, workshops, things that can help them improve their lives." Margaret nodded, her eyes still on the plans. "I want this too, Anna. Let's make it happen." Together, they began discussing the specifics, what funding would be needed, how they could rally more volunteers, and the timeline for making it all a reality. For the first time in years, Margaret felt herself diving into something with her whole heart, not for profit, not for prestige, but because she truly wanted to help. They worked for hours, and as the day turned into evening, Margaret felt an exhaustion that was different from anything she had experienced before. It wasn't the draining exhaustion of business meetings or the lonely tiredness that came from spending too much time alone. It was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from giving her all to something worthwhile. As she prepared to leave, Anna walked her to the door. "I can't tell you how much this means to us, Margaret. You're really making a difference," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. Margaret smiled, feeling a lump in her throat. "I think this is making a difference for me too, more than I ever expected." Anna nodded, giving her a knowing look. Sometimes giving back does more for us than we could ever imagine. Margaret left the community center that evening feeling hopeful. She knew this was just the beginning, that there would be challenges ahead, and that change didn't happen overnight, but she was ready to face whatever came her way. She had found a purpose that extended beyond herself, and for the first time, she felt like she was truly living. When she returned to her mansion, it no longer felt quite as empty. The grand halls and lavish rooms were the same, but Margaret had changed, and that made all the difference. She walked into the living room and stood by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames mirroring the warmth she felt within herself. Margaret picked up a framed photograph from the mantelpiece, a picture of her late husband, taken in the early years of their marriage. She looked at his smiling face, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. "I think you'd be proud of me," she whispered softly, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. She placed the photo back on the mantel, her eyes lingering on it for a moment before turning away. There was still so much to do, so many ways to continue building, growing, and giving, but Margaret knew she was ready for it. She had finally learned that the true measure of wealth wasn't in what she had accumulated, but in what she could give, in the connections she could forge, and in the lives she could touch. As she stood there, the house felt different, not just a mansion filled with objects, but a home ready to be filled with love, laughter, and new memories. And Margaret, for the first time in a long time, was ready to let all of that in. The following weeks were filled with preparation and anticipation. Margaret worked closely with Anna and the other volunteers at the community center to ensure that everything was ready for the new programs. She dedicated her time and resources wholeheartedly, pouring herself into the project with a determination she hadn't felt in decades. The community center, once a modest space, was now buzzing with new possibilities, and Margaret could see the excitement building in the children and parents who stopped by. On the morning of the community center's official opening of their new expansion, Margaret stood outside the building, taking in the sight of the gathered crowd. There were children, parents, and volunteers, each face filled with hope, excitement, and gratitude. She felt her heart swell with emotion as she saw Claire and her family in the crowd, waving at her. She waved back, her smile widening. Anna stood beside Margaret, her expression filled with pride. "Today is a big day," she said, giving Margaret a reassuring squeeze on her shoulder. Margaret nodded. "It is. I'm so grateful to be here, Anna. This is more than I ever imagined it could be." Anna smiled warmly. It's because of people like you, Margarete, that any of this is possible. Your generosity, your willingness to give not just your wealth, but your time and your heart. That's what makes the real difference. As the event began, Anna introduced Margarete, inviting her to speak a few words. Margarete hadn't prepared a speech, but as she stood in front of the crowd, she spoke from her heart. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice steady. "This community center has come to mean a great deal to me over the past few weeks. It's not just a building, it's a place where hope is nurtured, where dreams are given a chance to grow, and being a part of this has changed me in ways I never expected. I've learned that true wealth isn't measured by what we accumulate, but by the connections we make, the lives we touch, and the love we share." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the crowd, taking in the smiles, the nods of agreement. "I spent many years keeping to myself, believing that what I had built for myself was enough. But I realize now that what makes life meaningful isn't isolation or control. It's community, it's being here for one another, and it's making a difference in whatever ways we can. I'm so grateful to be here today and to be part of this community. Thank you." The crowd erupted into applause, and Margarete felt her heart swell with emotion. She stepped down, joining Anna once again, who beamed at her. "That was beautiful, Margarete," Anna said, her eyes glistening with tears. The rest of the day was a blur of smiles, laughter, and shared moments. Margarete watched as children explored the new learning space, their eyes wide with wonder. She saw parents speaking with volunteers about job training sessions, their faces hopeful. It was everything she had hoped for, and more. Later that evening, when the crowd began to disperse, Claire approached Margarete, her eyes shining. "Grandma, I'm so proud of you," she said, hugging her tightly. "You've done something amazing here." Margarete hugged her back, her heart full. "Thank you, Claire, but it's not just me. It's all of us, together." Claire smiled, pulling back slightly to look at her grandmother. "I know, but you made this happen, and you've inspired so many people, including me." Margarete felt her eyes well up, and she blinked back the tears, her voice filled with warmth. "I'm just so glad I have you all by my side." That night, Margarete returned home, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known for so long. The mansion, once a symbol of her isolation, now felt different. It was still grand, still vast, but it no longer felt empty. It was no longer just a house filled with expensive things. It was a home filled with love, connection, and purpose. Margarete walked into the living room, where she had placed a small Christmas tree by the window. It wasn't lavish or heavily decorated, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. She turned on the lights, the soft glow illuminating the room, and for a moment, she stood there, taking it all in. She thought of her late husband, of all the years they had dreamed of creating something meaningful together. She knew he would be proud of her, proud that she had finally opened her heart, that she had found a way to give back and to love again. Margarete sat down by the tree, her gaze drifting to the framed photograph on the mantelpiece. She reached for it, holding it gently in her hands. "I think we've finally done it," she whispered, her voice soft. "We've built something that truly matters." The house was quiet, but it was no longer the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of contentment, of knowing that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Margarete knew that there were still many days ahead, days filled with new challenges, new opportunities, and new moments of joy. And she was ready for all of it. For the first time in a long time, Margarete felt truly alive, her heart full, her spirit renewed, and her life filled with light. And she knew without a doubt that this was just the beginning.